So today we are talking about why you should use a tent as a shelter. And before you go down into the comments below and tell me how terrible of an idea that is and why you should use a hammock, next week's video is actually going to be called why you should use a hammock as a shelter. So this is really part one of a part two series. It's really going to be not me telling you what to do, and I don't want to talk you out of either shelter, but today we're really going to focus on tents and some of the really good reasons for using a tent and kind of combating some of the reasons that people don't use a tent. So as I was looking over this topic and I was trying to figure it out, I was looking online and I found some interesting comments from people, not necessarily on my channel, but just throughout the World Wide Web. And here's what some people had to say about using a tent as a shelter. Why would anyone ever want to sleep on the ground? Limited places to camp. A terrible night's sleep. Another person says, want a sore back? Sleep in a tent. Another person says, have you ever tried to set up one in the rain? That's actually a pretty good point. And somebody else said, tents are more expensive. So we're gonna talk about some of that stuff, and we're gonna kind of share some of the reasons why I think you really should be using a tent. The first reason that you should use a tent as a shelter is because sleeping on the ground is only as bad as your gear. I would say that you should invest in your big three: your backpack, your sleep system, and your shelter. And your shelter is something that you really shouldn't chintz on at all. I don't think it's safe to be chintzing on your shelter. I think you really could be putting yourself at risk in certain environments depending on what you're using for a shelter. So I think that a better shelter, if you're gonna put out a little bit more money, is absolutely worth it. Now, right along with that is your sleep system. So combined, they make up your tent and the sleeping experience that you're gonna have. So tenting and sleep system are kind of hand in hand in this situation. So when you're out into the backcountry and you have purchased that really junky sleeping pad, let me give you an example. Now, this isn't a junky sleeping pad, but this is the Gossamer Gear 1/8 inch pad. And some people actually use this as a pad. If you use this as a pad, I would love to know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your reasons for using it, and I would love to know if you actually think it's comfortable, and please be honest about this, because I would never find this pad comfortable. It's literally an 1/8 inch piece of foam. Now, the reason I have this is because I'm planning on using it this next week. I'm headed out for a trip and I'm gonna use it as a sit pad, and I'm gonna use it as sort of a insulator because I'm gonna be up higher altitude where it's gonna be a little bit colder. But if you're planning on going sleeping in a tent and you're gonna use something this thin, chances of you having a good night's sleep is gonna be pretty slim. Slim, get it? No pun intended. But maybe you've invested in an air pad, and an air pad is obviously going to be a lot more comfortable. So before you decide instantly that sleeping on the ground isn't comfortable, I'm gonna tell you it actually can be comfortable. I've figured it out. I will link the video right up here for you guys on how to be comfortable in a tent. I walk through step by step on how I am actually comfortable in a tent, and I have the ability to sleep all night long without waking up with backaches or anything like that at all. Now, I totally get it. There are other variables in there as well, for sure, like if you're sleeping on unlevel ground or the weather and that kind of thing, but sleeping on the ground really is only as bad as your gear. All right, number two, why you should be sleeping in a tent is it's a place to live. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it's an actual living space. So you're gonna be able to get into your tent at the end of a hard hike and just spread out. Put your gear all over wherever you want. You can cook in your vestibule. You can lay down, you can relax. It's a place for maybe 2 people to come inside and play cards while you're waiting out a storm. But it's a place to live. It's a living space. You got room to move. So I enjoy a tent for that reason as well. All right, number 3 is setting up a tent in the rain isn't fun, but it is possible. Now, setting up a tent in the rain is a whole lot easier if you have a specific type of tent, and that type of tent is going to be a single wall tent. Having a single wall tent means that you have 1 piece of fabric instead of 2 pieces of fabric for your tent. In other words, you don't have the inner mesh and a rain fly. You've just got the tent, which is also your rain fly. So laying that out on the ground and then putting maybe some trekking poles in it, which is typically what you do in a single wall tent, or some other pole structure to be able to lift that off the ground so the inside of the tent stays dry is really possible. Now, if you've got a double wall tent, what you're typically doing is you're setting up your screen tent portion first, which means that you're gonna have all that rain get inside the tent, because by the time you've got that screen portion set up, you don't really have time to get to the rain fly before the rain gets in there. So what some people do is they'll actually lay out their rain fly first, they'll shove that tent portion underneath, and they'll kind of work their way setting the tent up that way. Although I did find a video this week which was genius of a guy who developed some sort of a strap system, which was really interesting, on how to set up a double wall tent in the rain, and it worked really well. I'll link that video right here if you guys are interested. He has no idea I'm linking that video. I tried to email the guy to find out if he actually made this device or not, so you can check it out, but it was totally genius, and something totally look into if it's a big concern for you to have that double wall tent to be able to set up in the rain. Number 4 is typically a tent is the most protection from the elements that you can get for the least amount of weight. Now, I totally get it. There's other structures out there like a bivvy, or if you're just tarp camping, those are obviously going to be super lightweight options, but they're obviously not going to give you some of the benefits of a tent, like the living space and even some of the protection from the elements that a tent will. So generally speaking, and this is just like from the gear that I've got here, a very lightweight gear, an ultralight tent, sleep pad, and a quilt or sleeping bag is typically going to run you between 4 and 6 pounds. Now, I totally get it. They can get a whole lot heavier than that, and they can get a whole lot lighter than that, but for the average ultralighter, or for the person who's been doing this a while, that's typically what you can get that weight down to. Now, your first thought might be, well, what about hammock camping? Isn't that going to be lighter? Well, not necessarily, because you're having to add a few more components with a hammock. You've got a tarp, you've got the hammock, you've got the top quilt, you got the underquilt, or maybe a pad, you've got straps. So a hammock system tends to be a little bit heavier in most situations. So a tent really is one of the lightest options out there for the most protection available. All right, number 5 is that tents are typically really easy to set up, especially if you have a freestanding tent. I mean, you don't even need to stake a freestanding tent out. A freestanding tent is when you've got the pole structure that holds the tent up without having to stake it into the ground. And those are super fast and very easy to set up, especially if you've set it up a few times and you've kind of got it down. But if I handed somebody, let's say, an entire hammock setup, and I handed them a tent, for sure they're gonna be able to set up that tent way before they could ever set up that hammock. Another super easy tent option to set up is really like a trekking pole tent. You stake out the 4 corners, you put in the 2 trekking poles, and then you tension all the lines out. It really doesn't take much time at all, especially if you practice, let's say, in your backyard. But when you get to camp, it's so much less thinking. You just throw out your tent, you set it up, and you're done. All right, and number 6 is finding a place to set up your tent is not as difficult as people often make it out to be. People who are totally against using a tent for a shelter system in the backpacking world usually will say right out the gate that you just have very limited places to set up a tent, that if the ground is unlevel at all, or if there's a rock there at all, or if you're having to stop along a trail and there's too much brush, you're not gonna be able to set up a tent. I have never had a situation ever backpacking where I was unable to sleep in my tent that night. It just has never happened. I totally get it that you want your ground to be as level as possible. You don't want to have rocks on the ground. You don't want to worry about water. You don't want to worry about sticks and thorns and brush and all that kind of stuff. But it just takes walking a little bit further. It just takes kind of looking in a certain direction a little bit more before you can usually spot out a good place for your tent. And I will tell you this, if you're a hammock camper, it is literally just as difficult. When you get to camp, I can't tell you how many times where I was really having to search for good trees. As a matter of fact, in Wisconsin, this past February, I went with a bunch of guys and they had to camp in the shelter in their hammocks because they couldn't find places to hammock at the shelter, even though there were literally hundreds of trees around. So it can go both ways. The hammockers, I mean, you'd think with all these trees, right? Yeah, there'd be, I mean, just places to hammock.
So good hammock spots.
But let me,
zero hammock spots.
Bro, this is the best thing.
They built this specifically for hammocks, as you can tell.
I think that's a little bit of a myth that you can't find spots for your tent. All right, guys, I hope this video helps you guys out and why I think you should have a tent as your backpacking shelter. Next week, I'm gonna give you a video on why I think you should have your hammock as a backpacking shelter. If you guys like this video, make sure you hit that like button. Also subscribe for more. Hit the bell notification so I can send you a video every time it's released, and I will see you on the next one.